Thanks. So I'd like to invite Lucky Francesco back up here. So I have a handful of questions, but I'd love to open up to the audience, so please think about a couple of other questions you might have for these three. And then I think we're going to wrap with a couple comments from Linda at the end. Awesome. So first, let's start with you, John. The AI studio is incredibly fascinating. It sounds like the Knight Foundation really helped kind of kickstart things. But I'm just curious, was there another catalyst or inflection point before kind of the funding came through to, that triggered you thinking about this space, others in Quartz? I'm just curious kind of, what else drove kind of the creation?
So there are a couple of things. One is it's been an interest of mine for a long time. And I helped start the data news team at WNYC, which is the public radio station here in town. 6-7 years ago, it seems weird, but it used to be really hard to put a map on a website. Which seems weird, right? We do that all the time. But in reality, at that time, 6-7 years ago, you needed, if you were going to put a map in a newspaper on a website, you basically needed a $10,000 program called ArcView. You needed the data for that part of the world where you're going to make the map. And you needed the data that you're going to put on top of the map in that part of the world. And now we can almost do it with a single line and a URL, right? That's not that hard. I think that's kind of where we're at with AI in journalism now, right? There have always been cartographers. The New York Times was able to do beautiful maps even back then. But it was harder for a smaller newsroom. I think AI is the same situation. BuzzFeed, New York Times, a lot of larger companies are doing this. But it's been out of the hands of the folks at the smaller newsrooms. So that's part of it. The other part of it was that Quartz got a previous grant, which is why I started working at Quartz, to create a bot studio, which was explicitly designed to learn how to create conversational interfaces in the service of telling stories. And so we got a grant from the Knight Foundation to do that. We spent a year experimenting, and now Quartz does this as a commercial business for other organizations, and we've made bots for places like HBO's Westworld, which was, if you're familiar with the show, a great show to make a bot for, because that's kind of the premise of the show. And that's how we've monetized bot making. Whether or not we'll be monetizing our AI tools down the road, we kind of don't know, but at least Quartz being an innovator in journalism, it made sense for us to be a leader in using applied AI. And I'm pretty confident that the fact that we're putting AI and machine learning into the hands of our sort of line workers, our reporters and editors, is applicable to a lot of companies.
Awesome, that's great. You want to hand the mic to Lucky. So Lucky, you really introduced just a lot of interesting concepts and questions that we need to think about ethically from a society standpoint. There's a lot of connections back to Facebook and their influence in a lot of this. So if you were Mark Zuckerberg, what would you do?
I mean, I think I sort of alluded to this a little bit in my remarks. I mean, I think Mark is in a very tough situation right now, to be honest. I mean, they have 2 billion users. They have a business model that has, not only been successful for them, it's what investors have come to know them for. So the situation they're in right now is actually, I think, extremely tough. So if they, for instance, built very, very sophisticated fake news or hate speech detection models, as I said, those models will make mistakes, right? It's the limitation of the system in a lot of ways. Just in terms of what AI can do. I think there's a more troubling conversation, though, that at least is sort of solvable, or at least can be sort of maybe the focus for Facebook, which is really more about personal data. Right? I think the most troublesome thing to me is the way in which personal data is really the lifeblood of that business. particularly around micro-targeting, essentially targeting ads. And I think, part of this is really, if I was in his position, I would start plugging up the holes in which there are exploits. Again, this was not a system that was hacked, right? It was just used the way it was designed to be used. It was just used by some incredibly terrible people for crummy ends. So for instance, like transparency on the advertisement, right? Some level of pre-analysis before you put out a piece of information, right? Looking for, and I think this is really subtle, hate speech online. I hope many of you don't spend, your free time on the dark corners of the internet, but unfortunately, for better or for worse, we do, right? We're actually doing studies on hate speech in platforms like Reddit. I think the most troublesome thing, and this again is where AI can fail and probably will, is that people, when they're making hateful remarks online, they're not stupid. I mean, I think that's the mainstream understanding, is that these are, not just bigoted people, but stupid. They're actually fairly sophisticated. They talk in coded language. If they're making anti-Semitic remarks, they're going to use coded language because they know that certain words will get flagged immediately, and then they'll get kicked off the platform. So these are like very hard problems for a small platform to deal with. And then when you're at the scale of Facebook and you're dealing with the limited sort of accuracy to a system, it starts to break down. Having said all of that, the personal data thing needs to be fixed, and that's a conversation not just at Facebook, that's a conversation for us, and that's a conversation for policymakers.
That's great insight, thank you. Francesco, you've done a lot, and I think your company has great breadth and range. Over 1,500, it sounded like over 1,500 different applications or projects for different clients. What are a couple of your favorites, or what are some of the ones that have stood out the most to help guide you to the next phase?
My favorite obviously starts from actually the conversation we had about who owns the data. I built my own chatbot, I own my own data, and I love it. And I thought people were going to look me up for business. They look for philanthropy. I thought they were going to be interested in my judo experience. They look at my sailing stuff. So I learned a lot about myself, and I own my data. The biggest challenge for a company today is, first of all, most clients use AI conversational interface as a shiny object. They don't necessarily know what to do with the data. And the big question is who owns the data and what you do with it. And I think that for me the most interesting aspect is to start from within the organization, in which is less shiny, to use more knowledge transfer or knowledge exchange platforms within the employees or the family relatives. And before you launch the project outside, you build also this knowledge within the teams, what they can do and not do with the information they collected. And then obviously there is the company who wants to grow, so we have a lot of clients. They ask us for lead generation, for e-commerce and concierge. But all those should be together, collect information for the collective knowledge. The only problem is, if you are an employee of this company today and you leave, is it fair for the company to keep all that knowledge that you built for them and to develop models on top of that? So, from an ethical perspective, it's the same thing. I think what he was mentioning about Zuckerberg's problem is that all the information he collects, he puts it out, and he can't control it, and he can't make money if he doesn't put it out, because he can't make money with advertising. So when you're a company, you keep everything inside, you learn what to do, and then you grow from there, and you expedite your process.
That's well said. Who's got questions for these guys? Anyone? There we go.
Thanks so much. I have a question for John. And specifically, it's related to the companies like Automated Insights that you mentioned in your presentation. I'm a former business journalist, from financial journalist, and tools like that always scare me a little bit. I'm fascinated by them. And when it comes to reporting specifically on earnings, as a financial journalist, there are many things that you can focus on. You can focus on the top line, on EBITDA, you can, earnings per share. What is your experience with these tools right now as they exist? And also, there is obviously a possibility of gaming them. Someone could sort of figure out how they work, and then you write the news release about your earnings So they would come out, the headline would come out just right. And then, if it goes on to AP, I mean, you're potentially running, head to head against Bloomberg.
So all I can do, so Quartz doesn't use that kind of story generation system. So I can't speak from personal knowledge on this. Well, all I can say is what I've heard others talk about from Bloomberg and the Associated Press. And what they say is, first off, this is done for a lot of sort of, it's been done to increase the number of companies that they can do earnings reports for. And that for the big ones, obviously the financial journalists are still doing it, but it allows them to focus on those kinds of things and creates more time for them. That's what they say. And also, it is my understanding, although you'd have to check with them, that editors are supposed to go through them before they actually get out there. I don't know if that's always the case, so that's a question to ask. I think, the question of can you game it, I think that's going to be true for so much of AI, right? I mean, we've found, and there are amazing stories out there about adversarial examples where you can trick AI very simply. And I think that's something I'm hoping that they're addressing, and I suspect just because, as you say, things that come out of something like Bloomberg or AP have huge amounts of power as fact, and even rolling them back can be very difficult. And I know they put a big premium on that. So I would encourage you to explore that some more with them, but I'm afraid I can't speak for them for sure.
Anyone else? Maybe one more?
Thanks, Sam. I have a quick question for Lucky. Lucky, I was wondering, have you read or learned about the ethics within HR, within the enterprise world? I know outside there is a lot of talk about it with GDPR and other things, but if we just take one simple enterprise, might be GE or another organization, how we are handling ethics for AI here?
I mean, I think we're really just at the early start of this sort of broad panel survey. It's sort of like we nicknamed it like a technographic survey of like ethics and AI. HR is not one of the areas that I can sort of directly speak to, but I think it sort of raises a lot of really sort of complex questions, though, just from looking at it as an outsider. Because from what I understand, so much about what makes for a great human experience as an employee is really insightful sort of personalization to the sort of resources you get access to, the way in which you can develop your career. I think that's all great, especially when it's mediated by people. There is, unfortunately, I think, a fuzzy line where that type of insight could cross a certain point where it goes from being something that's supportive and then something that is counterproductive. And I think these are, I don't really, hopefully I did not come off today like I have any answers, right? It's really, these are really hard questions. And sort of my only sort of advice and my own sort of perspective is we should feel comfortable asking those questions and saying sometimes, I don't know, right? And having that conversation. Yep.
Any other questions?
Sorry to jump in here. So I think a lot of the people in the room are marketing and communications professionals, and there's a lot of the things that we've talked about, or some of the examples that have been spoken about, is like the one-way street, right? Like it's the putting out a story into the external environment, and a lot of what the team does here sometimes is like the firefighting, right? It's like we get the internal or the external push to us, and there has to be a response, a press release, a statement written. And this is kind of an off-the-cuff question, I know, catching you guys off guard, but do you guys see an environment or a potential opportunity where there is a solution leveraging AI with human in the loop that assesses or supplements the response back to, the media inquiry that comes in, or to the, the article that gets written that we have to put a statement back out to, that automates or pre-populates the statistics that we have to go to, do the firefight with?
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm going to sort of answer you with a little bit of a different kind of example, which the Washington Post has done. So the Washington Post has data for several years. They've had data on a story that's published. So they publish a story, right? They hit publish, and the publishing of the story and the first sort of tweeting or Facebook posting of that story will go out, and it has an arc, right? Like it'll sort of slowly grow and get more popular, or maybe it goes and dies out, or it'll like launch and suddenly it's like viral. And so knowing, and they attack this problem, you can Google this is out there, and they've spoken about it. Because they've used machine learning to track those different slopes, basically how viral things get, and they can tell within the first 90 minutes of a tweet whether or not it's going to be one of those. And what that does is it allows them to adjust, right? You can remake the homepage. You can decide to do something different. Like they can, because they've seen so many of them, they can predict what the arc of this, the virality of this thing would be. And if you think about that, that might be the kind of thing. And I know that there are products out there or in development to sort of keep an eye on your brand, right? Like, is something about your brand taking off somewhere, right? I'm sure, I mean, if you don't have like alerts already set, I'm sure you do, but like if you can imagine that using that data, you could say, oh, the pattern of this is such that it's going to take off, either positively or negatively, maybe that's another model. But there's probably ways to do that, and there are probably companies thinking about how to do this, but the ability to detect, to predict the arc of the virality of something is something this post has actually done.
What we do, we build chatbots that have conversations about specific topics and in format of a banner. And we follow news, and when something is published, if we have the option, through a media company, we can buy advertising space next to that article. So you might have that article that bash your brand, and you have your voice next to it. So it's a little bit like a arm wrestling in terms of advertising, but if you're ready, if your communication team knows that critics are out there or they could come out, what you do, you build conversations to explain the truth and to refine the conversation and collect information from the people. Our chatbots, they can actually be also on Facebook or LinkedIn as opposed to opening the browser and all the information goes into your database. So the idea is to just identify the strategic positioning where the article came out, and then pair with the chatbot that brings you the data, but the host, Facebook, LinkedIn, the Wall Street Journal doesn't see the results. So those are your proprietary data sets that you decide what to do. So that's how we manage reputation management and crisis management.
Awesome. Thank you guys so much. Really appreciate it. I'd like to invite Linda Boff up here to just give us a couple parting thoughts.
So I have nothing erudite to say after listening to our guests, except, first of all, a giant thank you to the folks who joined us today, who changed schedules and travel, et cetera, to be here. And I want to make sure I name everybody. So I have my list here: Loop Ventures, Miso, Wonder, Baca from GE, Hugging Face, and the two Qs, Quartz and Corlo. So guys, thank you. Just a big round of applause for our guests. I would say when GE is at our best, we are trying, and this group in particular is kind of at the tip of that spear, to provoke new thinking. And as much to ask questions, I love, Lucky, what you said. I don't think any of us have answers, but I think the session today helps provoke some of those questions. And what does AI look like for our marketing communications department? What does it look like for HR? What does it look like for people? What does it look like? We have some friends here at GE Capital. God knows what it could look like at GE Capital. But I think that's exactly what we hope to get out of this, is somewhat of a where things are going, but a lot of provocation that we can take back and use to question and provoke great thinking on our part. So a huge thank you. And Megan Newhouse, Sasha Houlihan, Andrew Aziz, Sam Olston. Did I forget anybody from the... Carolyn Kasich, of course. Carolyn's always, and if it's good, Carolyn's always involved. It's Carolyn Kasich. So thanks, guys, for pulling this together, and enjoy the rest of the day. Thank you.